even though we're a little short-handed, because otherwise we won't get our work done. And so welcome everybody. We don't need to introduce. We don't need elaborate introductions. We're all here. And are there any comments? I take a motion to approve the minutes, then we can discuss them if you have any thoughts on it.
So moved. Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any concerns about the minutes? Any additions, modifications you want to suggest? Hearing none, I assume they're approved. The discussion of results from 2/7 stakeholder sessions. And Chris, how are we going to do that?
Well, you have in front of you, we're all given the report that Harvey and I put together after that, excuse me, after that session. And I think the three major points that Harvey and I came away from this with was that in general, the stakeholders were happy, gratified that there was a strategic plan underway, and they appreciated being brought in early into the process. So there was a positive response as far as that went. That having been said, there was concern about two-way communication with the board. Apparently there's clearly emerged that there's some history there, and many of the stakeholder groups felt that they had had difficulty in the past having their input or expressing their input, and so there was a little bit of concern and suggestions that there needed to be some at least serious continuation of the process in order to build some trust and to build some rapport with the board and the stakeholder groups. That having been said,
Chris, can I stop you there
Sure.
for a distinction?
Sure.
The opportunity to share their opinion, or that their opinion wasn't followed? There's sometimes a little...
I think both,
Really both.
to be honest. There was some discussion about they felt that the board's agenda production process was something that frustrated them sometimes in getting their input in. And also, some groups felt that their input had not been heard. So I would say that there were people on either side of it.
Do they want to have more time for comment about strategic initiatives and how we're measuring? They need better new ways to engage in that?
It seemed that a lot of this was history, really, and what was coming out was historic perspectives, and that in the past, that they felt that they had not had that opportunity. So yes, they would like the opportunity to have, in direct engagements. That one of the terms that came out was, face-to-face engagements in a circle, two-way conversation, this sort of thing. I think they felt that the conversation was not interactive enough, and this wasn't everyone, but it was fairly general feelings along that respect. But I would say that the last positive point I'd make, before basically giving the opportunity to question me on any of the specifics in that report, was that most of the stakeholder groups felt that they could do an awful lot to help with communication with their constituencies, and they were willing to do that. Pretty much everyone. The business community reacted very strongly in that way, that they wanted to become involved, they wanted to help in any way they could. The PTA was very vocal in their desire and their offer to help with the communications going forward in terms of advocating for the plan and working forward for the plan. So there was a lot of positive response. I would say the response was generally positive, and the only negative piece that came out was this business about feeling that there had been some difficulty with communications in the past, and they would like to feel that this communication was something real that was established. A concern that what we had done on the 7th was a one-time affair. So I think the answer there is that you have the opportunity to address and solve a lot of that perception simply by keeping this process rolling on and on and on.
The process would be in development plan, and once we implement it, we say, how are we doing, strengths, weaknesses, and
And even as you go forward with implementation, your opportunity to adjust strategies, launch new initiatives, engaging these people could be a part of that throughout the course of the term, depending on what kinds of strategies you're launching. So there's that opportunity to engage them on more of a continuous basis.
There was a comment made about branding. Was it branding the strategic planning process, or branding the eventual work product, or branding an effort to improve education? Do you remember that it was under stakeholder?
Mhm.
Do you remember the context of that, or what?
This was one of the conversations that we had in this group, or?
Well, it was from a
Stakeholder.
stakeholder
It was from the
report.
stakeholder.
I think it was when you visited with
Yeah,
the...
page 3, question 3 is giving a great deal of what you guys
Mhm.
are talking about. It's got a lot of those things that need to happen to have partners to be effective in implementing the plan, and that's where the branding campaign, there's a message in there, Dan, about that.
Yeah.
I just wonder who, kind of what the, yeah, a little more, do you have any more detail on that? Because I thought that was an interesting idea, that we would have a unified commitment in this state, and a lot of people from other fields create a brand, a tagline, and get people behind a wave. Was that the nature of that?
Yeah, and it was a comment that came from some of the business people who felt, that essentially PR for the plan was an important piece of this, to not, the conversation really, a lot of it centered around how to make everyone in Indiana aware of this plan and bring everybody aboard the plan. And they felt that was, as I say, one of the things that they could help do. So I think the branding largely came out of a conversation from the business community, where they said one of the things we can help you do is to brand this and to make it more palatable, so that everybody in the state knew it and got behind it.
David?
Once we approve the strategic plan, hopefully in collaboration with all of these stakeholder groups, when we get to branding, that might be more of an implementation part. And I see some of the stakeholders, particularly from the business community, being able to provide expertise in that area that we may not have. Is there a sense from the business community to potentially provide some personnel for us, maybe gratis, that would help us with the branding, help us with the PR aspect, and so forth? Is that a possibility?
Absolutely. I think if you split the sort of the communities into, or the groups of stakeholders into the business community, higher ed was largely involved in, but business was a very strong involvement, higher ed was involved, and some other more community-oriented groups. The business people were, in some ways, the most enthusiastic, I would say. They really came across as being very enthusiastic about the plan, the effort, more positive, possibly. The negativity seemed to come partly from higher ed, and to a certain extent from some of the community groups that we dealt with. The business.
What's a community group? Give me examples.
There were, trying to remember the specific groups involved, but there was a number of community groups in the second session.
Some of the most negative comments came from the Urban League.
Yeah. The Urban League and trying to put faces and names together, which is, since it's been a month, it's hard, but.
I think they felt short shrift had been given to the achievement gap, and making sure that was reflected in the State Board of Ed's planning efforts.
Now, I would say I've received that commentary over the years in my service to the board, and we do have a very specific goal around that. So to make sure all students learn, and then within that, when we unpack that and engage in various communities on closing that gap, would be an awesome achievement for this board and for education, more importantly, in Indiana. So that was kind of the, we can't have a two-tier system. It was interesting, nationally, around 30% of low-income groups are going to college, and 9% graduate in 5 years in a high-tech knowledge economy. Well, that ensures an underclass. We can't be part of that. So I could understand the agitation, frankly. Would be something to pay attention to.
But there'll be a good group going forward as you identify strategies for closing that type of gap. And you begin to launch some projects maybe to do some specific things, engaging that group in the thought process or in becoming an advocacy group or something for what you're doing. There's kind of opportunities downstream, I think, for themselves.
Are you speaking of the Urban League in Northwest Indiana?
No, the Indianapolis Urban League. That was some of the conversation in the room. That gentleman in particular, Mark Russell from the Urban League.
Yeah, I know, Mark.
Our initial attempt to engage stakeholders seemed to be successful. I was really pleased reading the report, and thanks for doing that job. What's the plan for re-engagement? Will there be continuing two-way communication, and if so, what is the proposed plan?
Well, I think that's one of the challenges that needs to be developed. Clearly, I think this all speaks to your goal 3. And one of the things I'd say is that really what you've done, the communication that started on the 7th is an example of a strategy that would be in support of a yet undefined objective under that goal number 3. And maybe the backbone of the primary strategy, which is to keep an ongoing process of communication. I mean, the clear message was that if this doesn't happen again, it sends a message
Absolutely.
about the
That's why
nature of
we
communication.
we need to follow up. I see these comments coming in as advisory, and they're very good comments, but when it comes to policy, there's a different group making that.
Yeah.
And so from a historical perspective, I appreciate the chairman's comment about maybe historically sometimes comments were put forward in an advisory fashion, and the board in their wisdom decided to go in a different direction.
Sure.
So as we re-engage these stakeholders, hopefully they understand that we're dealing with a number of constituencies that have different priorities, and so not taking everything they say is not an indication that we don't support it.
No.
It's just that we have competing demands.
No, and I don't think that was the implication. I think the implication was that they just wanted ongoing opportunities for communication. One of the things that was suggested was it would be more effective, rather than calling everybody together, it would send a message if the board went on a roadshow and in some form went on a roadshow and
Yellow
talked to
school
these
bus.
people in their in their own home turf. Essentially, would show an important piece. And again, that phrase that came up, face to face in a circle. And one of the groups that insisted the in a circle has to be in there. And I think the implication that I heard from that was that they weren't necessarily satisfied with the board on the stage and them at the lectern in the front, but they wanted to actually be sat down and engaged with in a conversational way. But again, I would not say that the negativity was such that it couldn't be overcome by a concerted effort on the part of the board to keep this communication running. And I think the opportunities are very great under that sort of an approach to enlist help from the business community and branding, help from all these organizations in terms of talking about their constituencies. There was a lot of advocacy, for instance, of including students, for instance, as a stakeholder group, and they can give you access to different types of students and different types of communities. So, we felt it was positive. I think both Harvey and I were a little taken back by the business of trust building, because it was there in many, many different forms. But the rest of it was quite a positive engagement, I think.
Part of the answer to your question, I think, is in that goal 3 area as you flesh out some of the strategies.
Right.
Make that part of the ongoing process, looking for ways, throughout the course of the year, since this is becoming a dynamic process, to engage some of the things you decide to do.
So there almost certainly be an objective in there emerging about an iterative and two-way communication plan and a marketing, branding, and getting people's attention around this will be the key. And that's the key, frankly, to leadership, because the more broadly and deeply it's owned, then you have a chance.
And even to the point of looking question was raised a moment ago, does the business community have resources to help with, some sort of a marketing campaign? As you roll forward with the work, looking to the different groups to say, maybe we can get a resource of this type from this group, or, and looking to engage them in that way, to really put some skin in the game, so to speak. So I think that's an opportunity.
I mean, I don't know, in the very least in terms of what follow-up has been done with the stakeholder groups after the February 7th session. It would seem to me a suggestion I would make would be to at least communicate with them in some way. If the board could send them a appreciative.
I sent them a thank you letter
Okay.
to everybody, and then they all asked to come back again at some point in April to help weigh in on the next version, because we only gave them the goals, and they all thought the goals needed to be more specific, and Chris and Harvey did a great job of saying the objectives are going to be much more specific.
Sorry, were you coming to our meeting today?
Was there, and I'm looking at the feedback now as much of it was around the goals, but was there much discussion around the mission and vision as we had articulated it? Was that part of that conversation, and did it have a meaning to them? Did we?
It did, and I
we thought it would.
I think that was the Claire mentions quite accurately that since the goals were so lean by the time we went into that session, there wasn't a whole lot for them to lock into in the goals, and there was some frustration expressed in terms of what do these goals mean. But the mission and the vision, I think, were very well received. I think the specific pieces of that the biggest discussion that, at least in my sessions, was around the term innovation, and there was a concern that innovation for innovation's sake was not a positive thing, and they wanted to, it was easy for me to address that one, because you all have had this conversation that, your innovation needs to be based on best practices and on data. So I think you had that conversation, but in terms of just the word innovation, I think rang some bells in people's minds. That was the main comment that I can remember. There was a suggestion, there's a phrase in I believe the vision, which talks about knowledge, skills, and character. And there was a suggestion that maybe character should be put first, something simple like that, just say character, knowledge, and skills, because they felt that character was an important piece of this. Some people expressed a concern that they didn't see a direct mention of diversity and equity, but that was also a factor. I mean, all students, I almost was at the point of saying something about, do you want to say all students including this subgroup? I mean, is that necessary? So I think the language was there. I think people saw problems that came from what they brought to the table with them. But in general, I would say that the mission and the vision were very well received. And we did actually bring out, and this is something that the superintendent raised on the call that we had last week with Dan and her, about, where do these big ideas that you had of accessibility, accountability, and achievement, where do those ideas fit into this now? We actually wound up writing those on a flip chart so that we had them also up there. And I've thought about that since that conversation, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself in a sense, because this is more of a conversation about our objectives piece than the stakeholder piece. But sometimes strategic plans include a component that we don't usually include, which is something around core beliefs or basic values and core beliefs. And if you want to keep those big concepts in front of everyone, because I think the discussion that we had decided that those informed all the work that you did and all the goals that you did, and it wasn't reasonable to tag them to any one goal. And maybe considering another component ultimately in your strategic plan that is a set of core beliefs, and they arrange around those three pieces. That's one way that you could keep those explicitly as part of the strategic plan without necessarily putting them in a given goal. So that's one thing to consider as you go forth. It's an easy piece to add. You would add it essentially to the title of the strategic plan up with the goals. These are our core values.
The beauty of I'm trying to the Council on Black Children, the goals need to be global, equity to be included, Example, the mission of pre-K education provide high-quality opportunities for every child. And of course, our goal says all students. There could be a narrative on substantive traits. I was thinking of a narrative, a qualitative introduction about who we are and what we're about. Might, could be a preamble, some people call it, a preamble of substantive traits. I would even participate and take a hand at writing it, but when you have a simplistic goal that says all children will learn, I'm assuming that means all. Seems that's pretty clear. And they have to, at high levels. Because, as a matter of fact, I was just reading a report lately, higher ed in large part have figured out the social and even economic funding of low-income children, but young people. But if you come with a weak curricular background, poor skills, thinking abilities, vocabulary, etc., that's what causes the graduation rates to be so dismal and have a two-tier system. So it's really about all children getting an excellent education. And but if that isn't unpacked a bit, I suspect you could be left wondering.
That's a good point.
What's the depth of the commitment? So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Well,
Brad,
and I
do you
think
have
it's the sort of access and achievement distinction to a certain extent that providing equal access to people that start off with sort of challenges doesn't necessarily do that. There may be necessity to pay additional attention to the people that come with the less skills.
Yeah,
Almost, the lack of equity forces you into a set of practices that are not necessarily equitable practices, but the idea is that the achievement needs to be equitable and what has to be done to.
If you set the
to
goal,
get to
then
that
you work
point.
back and design systems. And
I was just going to circle back just to the word innovation just for a second. I think it's a good discussion we're having because I wouldn't have thought that word would have set off alarms, but if I'm understanding what you're saying, and I think I do, it's a healthy conversation because it is a concern that I feel when I'm out visiting schools that they've now translated the term innovation into a reform change, and it represents an unpopular change that they see as making their jobs more restrictive, more burdensome. And obviously we need to be innovative because we've got a challenging world that we're graduating students into that's changing faster than we can sit here and come up with strategies to help them get ready for that. So I think it's healthy to understand the language. I'm not afraid to stay with that word innovation, but I think it may have implications for how we frame the wording around strategies so that it's seen as very proactive, very pro-student, and not necessarily interpreted as somehow anti to the job that teachers are trying to do. And I think that's probably where that, I'm asking, I guess, is if I'm on target, maybe with how I'm perceiving your interpretation of that discussion around the word innovation, because I don't want to lose that word. That word to me is critical.
Well, I think unquestionably there has been a number of changes in recent years, if you look at the standards, for instance. And that's, when you change standards to a educational organization, it's very disruptive. And so I think that's one of the concerns is that those sort of changes, when they keep coming that quickly and there's no time to settle down and start to put the practices in place to support those changes, that it becomes very difficult. So I think that was partially the context in which that was coming from, is that there's not a steadiness to a lot of, and you're doing a lot of work now to try and get to that point, but I think the important message is that once you've established a set of standards, assessments, and expectations for achievement, that those at least be maintained long enough that the entire organization can get behind them and reorganize themselves. Because it takes, as we know from working with them, it takes districts a good 18 months to react to any kind of mandate that comes down, because for the rest of the year they've made their budgets. They're running along following those budgets so that they can't even begin to think about changing until the next budget cycle. And that takes them into another school year at least. So if changes happen at a rate that's, every couple of years, they never do really get able to do it, because once they've realigned to the new standards or the new expectations, they need a couple of years to make sure to go through a continuous improvement process and really get that sort of thing working. So I think that's where the fear of innovation comes at, and we hear this nationally.
Sure.
And exactly for the reason that you bring up, because situations are changing fast enough, so fast. Federal requirements change quickly, and the speed of change is overwhelming the local education agencies generally across the country.
That's why I'm looking forward to the discussion around, and I'm making an assumption that we are moving towards a balanced scorecard and the ability of that to communicate broadly and clearly a sense of direction, because I think one of the things we've been fighting is trying to keep the masses in communication what's going on. And I think when you lose that, then you feel like things are being done to you instead of things being done with you, because you're not understanding how you fit into that larger overarching picture. And so maybe that's where that kind of an instrument may help us in terms of keeping that out in front of everybody. What is our goal? How do we achieve that mission? How do we achieve that vision?
It might be wise to, as we have these meetings and discussions, a few things occur to me, is to keep our vision and mission and goals up on a board and bounce things off of that constantly. Two, we've made a point here today, and I read the material and you made it today. This will have to be a journey we go on together, and not everybody will agree with. That would be stalemate. We'd sit forever working at that. But everybody's engaged in the conversation who wants to sincerely improve. There was a comment, if you want to head down the road of innovation, use some research. And I think we have, but what research can, there's enough research out there you can prove and disprove just about everything. But in other words, whatever innovation we pursue. The other thing that's intriguing to me is make very good choices here at this level. What we want to achieve, why it's very important to achieve, and let subsidiarity dictates, that principle dictates, the creativity will come from the educator and the parents and local communities on how to get there. If we could give them destination, think of this as a journey, clarity of destination, help with some avenues, make careful discernments as to what we put out there. You can't operate schools from this level. All you have to have is a powerful, compelling reason to get up in the morning and innovate. And it's always been a tough balance, a loose tight. You want to be tight, stick with goals over a long time, make sure you're measuring, but be very loose of how you get there and let creativity reign. Because frankly, we've been beating our head against all students will learn. A lot of educators worked hard at that. And some individual schools, you can find a magnificent charter school that has some great progress on that, an outlier, traditional public school, parochial schools, all sorts of schools will figure that out in certain areas, and we need to understand it and let that go and feed it and highlight it. So I think at this level, make some careful discernments, allow people the freedom to figure out how to do that within the resource base they have intrigues me also. So choosing for this committee and eventually the board and the governor and everybody that will join in on this in the department, choosing will be very, very
Exactly.
critical.
And you've raised some key points that are good transition points to the discussion around the objectives and then the strategies.
Okay.
If you want to, chart, set a direction, but be loose on the other end of it, so that the districts and schools have a lot of flexibility, then that in and of itself is almost a statement of strategy. And when you make those kind of decisions, then you can begin to craft things like, if you want to help schools close the gap, for example, rather than being prescriptive from here to say this is how you do it, you could be just gathering data on schools that are successful at doing that and making that available to everyone, and not telling them which ones work, but being a clearinghouse for here are strategies that seem to have worked in different settings. So you're helping to close the gap, but you're not being prescriptive.
Interestingly, that came up clearly, and it's in our minutes, and the superintendent's working on it, is what the schools that beat the norm, make sure we understand who that is and why, because there's a lot of knowledge there to be shared, and educators author it, basically.
we've been talking about data-driven decision-making, and that's what we're talking about in the discussion around innovation. We're not just talking about any innovation, we're talking about proven innovations that have a positive effect on achievement. And so that notion of data-driven is really important for us at the policy level. I like the notion of loose and tight. That concept is a good one, but whatever we're proposing conceptually on a policy level, it needs to be based on something.
Right.
And so as we discuss objectives, as you propose certain objectives for us, I'm always going to be asking, where's the research behind this? And it doesn't have to be necessarily Indiana schools, and there are some great schools in Indiana, but we have 49 other states that are doing some really exemplary kind of school practices. So hopefully we expand that notion of research and bring forward what is the supporting data that is behind the objective. So as we meet with our stakeholders and they ask, well, who came up with this? How did you come up with this? We have the data behind any conceptual objective that we're setting forth. So is that possible, and as we talk about this, that maybe you can provide that background information as to why we're pushing this particular objective?
Well, yes, obviously we can do that, but I would say that probably need to think about a step beyond that, which is to make this an institutionalized part of how, you go about the strategic planning process. And again, that's one of the main reasons that we've advocated for bringing in these sponsors from the DOE to become intimately involved in crafting this stuff, because you have in the state, in the organization, people who can give you access to that information. You don't need CELT for that necessarily. And CELT won't always be here, so you don't want to be relying on an organization that will inevitably go away when you have an organization that you can build internally. So I think the idea of creating an organizational structure and what the organizational structure will look like, whereby the board will go forward, is absolutely crucial. I think, one of my observations about the conversations that you've been having around objectives, one of the issues that's faced the board is essentially which are the important lagging indicators to look at. So even at the objective level, you need that kind of input, I think, from people that you have in the organization and in the state, and people who will be here this afternoon, that we're going to start that process of working with those people. So what I would advocate is that you think about how do you institutionalize that process within Indiana with people that you have ongoing access to make sure that you are making those decisions based on data. Because you're absolutely right, here in isolation as a board, you may not necessarily have access to all that information that you would need, but you can get it with a phone call.
So what you're recommending as part of our dashboard, we'll have an infrastructure of people, talented people from DOE advising us along the way, right, and sort of being an outside but yet inside group, providing data, providing good information in regard to the dashboard, as well as some things we might be proposing.
Sure. Okay. And it doesn't have to be just the DOE, it could be universities also.
Some external?
Yeah, that's another way to engage your stakeholders. There's two ways to use the data, to back to your point.
Yes.
When you establish your objectives, the what you want to accomplish, that you want to bring in data to know where you are with regard to that objective. And for example, if your objective is to improve, reading scores, then you want to know what your reading scores actually are over the past several years, and then you can begin to be informed about how much of a improvement you want to make, what % increase in reading scores. So you want to use data when you set the what to know where you are, but then when you want to decide, well, how are we going to improve reading scores? What are we going to do? Are we going to use this program or that program? That's when the research comes into play to say, schools have used this strategy or this tool, and the effect on reading scores was this. So the research comes into play when you start setting the strategy and picking practices that you think will make a difference. So,
Just one specific example, the last round of iRead scores, and we're talking about the achievement gap. Hispanics and African Americans, their rate went up, I believe it was 10% in 1 year. We need to pinpoint those schools in Indiana that really did a great job with the achievement gap and really analyzed to see what they did, and then disseminate that information among other schools. So we have that concept somewhat available to us, and now it's time to take advantage of it.
sort of a clearinghouse of best practices.
You know, before 9:45 is coming close, but there's a couple interesting points that have come up here worth capturing. To a reflective discussion when progress is made, what happened, because I lived through the board 3 years of Anna Schultz and the group. They worked very hard, set the iRead 3 in motion, set policy in motion. There was a focus. People came together around that focus. There were clear recommendations process. If you had a better one, we let people do it. But when you start seeing gains like that, don't jump off that horse. You know, I like that. I also think that we ought to look at all the resources available and how do you align it? How do we do our work in the department? So if the board sets these goals, then how do you align the work of the department behind it? What kind of expertise, what kind of information do we need to provide? Timeliness of it, the accuracy, what kind of forums? You know, we may want to align our resource around forums, practices that seem to be highly effective in Indiana, raising achievement or closing gaps. Or the technology is coming available. There's a new day out there for the innovator.
Right.
There's new ways. There's better ways. You know, we need not be afraid of that. There's a lot of opportunity. In some ways, it's going to be less expensive. I mean, there's opportunities we've never had before. So I'm excited about, I think the major point we picked up with that, make sure there's an engaged, ongoing, iterative conversation with our partners. Clarity, align resources around it. If one of your main things is that the state level, the best thing we can be is really good at information and providing in policy. Then people know how to chase the policy, and we can gain information that each district doing alone just is impractical. Whereas we don't need to be prescribing, oh, do this and do that. That doesn't work anyway. But what are the aids and assistance besides clear goals, objective vision? What are our best contributions to the dedicated and innovative educators and groups that care deeply? Well, I think we're heading down the right track. Appreciate everybody's input.
Yeah, I think just to pick up on what Brad was saying about the balanced scorecard, it does give you a good opportunity to communicate an awful lot of stuff. It has to be applied in a concerted communication effort, but it does allow you to talk about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how you're going to achieve it. And the other thing I would point out about, you know, the tight, loose innovation point is that I think it's reasonable to say that organizations that are doing a good job they earn the right for flexibility and innovation, and that it has to be an earned, you know, I would suggest setting a expectation that that's an earned right. It's not something you don't have the right to necessarily innovate if you're not producing results. And if you're not producing results, I would say that the central organization has a right to at least recommend and communicate best practices that are working in other areas. Sometimes these organizations just aren't aware of what's going on. So you have a good opportunity to communicate these things. But if you have districts that are not performing or schools that are not performing, at some point you have to question whether you should simply give them the outcomes that you expect and let them go at it in the same way. You may need to prescribe and say, here's a set of promising practices that are working in the state based on research. Here's what we're doing. Choose one of these until you've proven to us that you can meet the expectations that we've made, the clear expectations that we've made. So that might be something to think about. Because I know I've heard your many times expressed a hesitancy to be too prescriptive in terms of specifics of what's going on.
The how to.
Yeah, at
or
some
they'll
point.
do this isn't so much important as, here's together what we need to do to advance culturally, socially, economically,
But
in an
ultimately,
international and global economy and a culture that we're going to live in.
and then that's important to set those expectations.
Yeah.
At a certain point, when you see that certain
Yeah.
parts of the state are not meeting those expectations, something needs to be done that's a little bit more specific, probably, in terms of
Yeah.
expectations of what's going on. In the same sense that, districts, there's takeover of schools. You've gone through that. That's something that is done in extremis, but it indicates that you can't just let that go on
Children
forever.
can't be left.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, their
Exactly.
future is too important. So, do we have any other comments on stakeholder session? Because it's time to move forward. Superintendent Rich, what'd you hear from Brad? I mean, BJ.
Did not have it on his calendar,
Oh, okay.
and so he's not here today. And they're just starting ISTEP today, so he's not sure he's here tomorrow. So he was gonna check and get back.
He indicated he was confused. He thought he was supposed to be here tomorrow, not today. Because tomorrow's just the staff, not board members. So it's just the four of you today.
Well, I'm just gonna see how good.
We're small and mighty.
Small and mighty? Well, Sarah, and she has,
Well, given the small and mightiness, we have to certainly work as a group.
Oh, yeah.
We cannot break into small groups.
which
So
is great.
I think we have to move ahead with that different structure from the one that we had thought about. So again, I guess I would, if we're moving on, I would ask if anyone has any questions or comments about the report that Harvey and I provided about capturing sort of what we're trying to do, but differently. Capturing the work to date on objectives and any general questions about that, and then I think we need to just settle down and we've got probably another 2 hours before noon, so we could spend about 45 minutes per objective, per goal, working through those sort of objectives. So anything that was confusing or divergent in the material that we provided for you.
Comments? No?
Pretty good.
Maybe we ought to get to work on objectives and just see how we do.
Alrighty, well, I don't have any exercise or activity for us about objectives. We pretty much are at the point of continuing the conversations that we've had in the past and trying to move towards something at least to capture. Now, I will say that, repeat the comment that I made, that in some cases the choice of lagging indicators tied to these objectives may well be something that you need some input from the sponsors on. So whether you can pick the specific, for instance, if we talk about goal number 1, it seems to me, it's an achievement goal. There's a desire to improve achievement and possibly improve achievement across the board, but you probably want to focus on the most strategic achievement metrics that are the most foundational and the ones that are the most important to kind of flesh out the metrics and the lagging indicators for objectives in that goal. And whether you have one objective, whether you have several objectives, is entirely a matter of what emerges from your conversation.
So we start with goal 1.
Sure.
And we just open up some ideas of what would be objectives we'd absolutely want to latch onto that would give a clear signal what we're after.
Do you have goal 1 that you can put on the overhead?
Surely. Find it.
I'll open up a comment and then see what people think of this, but on that goal 1, I know the state chamber had a strategic planning process that was Indiana 2025 or 2020, I can't remember now. It was on the, it was a year-long process. But human capital was a big goal, and then under that was education. So they have some clear objectives around STEM, international, where we're at, closing achievement gaps. Superintendent, you might have a better feel for this. How many significant major organizations have some kind of a strategic plan with a goal around education that have set some objectives? And it just occurred to me after reading your notes, if people saw their objective or something like their objective in our plan, they'd say, yeah, now you're listening. Which, I mean, but I don't know.
Well, actually, most of those organizations that were invited to our focus group probably have strategic plans with education around them. So, like, I just attended not too long ago the Center for Leadership Development.
Mhm.
You know, I attended their strategic planning piece, and they have very specific education goals. 100 Black Men have a strategic plan. They have a very specific section on education. You know, the Indiana Chamber, they almost all of them have something within their strategic plan that correlates, you know, with
These regional.
with education. So United Way, they have many early learning strategy pieces, and I've attended several summits on their strategic planning process of that. So they all have, there's several who have STEM, you know, initiatives. So most of them have that, and it would delay our process here a little bit, but it might be worth time gathering those together and taking a look at those. Number one, that values the stakeholders, that we want to know what it is that you've already indicated as your priorities with education. But yeah, they've got them. I requested from 100 Black Men a copy of their strategic plan not too long ago. I've attended several of their functions.
You know, I'm on the board CLD, and that's what we do basically. You know, and what you could do is we could plow ahead with our work, and then you could do a research project on these, and then juxtapose where we're
Talk about alignment with other groups and how it works.
maybe pick up some better language from theirs and vice versa. Brad?
Yeah, and I'm just thinking here, and maybe this is wrong of me to think of it this way, but as I look statutorily at what our responsibilities are, and I understand there are going to be other groups that have education goals, and there does need to be an alignment, I want to look at that. Would it not be more appropriate, though, for the board to forge ahead responsibly, and I think we're doing it in a responsible fashion, and trying to set that direction and let other groups align to us? I'm hearing us talk about us aligning with them, and I'm worried about if it should be the other way around, that the board is setting the overarching vision of the state and then working in partnership with other organizations. And I'm being very mindful of what you said earlier, Craig, about us not feeling like we're doing something to them, but I'm also worried about that somehow driving what we do and moving us off of maybe a critical discussion of the state needing to go in certain places. I don't know, but it just seems that may be something we need to talk through.
Yeah, I think you're making a good point. It would be
Well, I think some of it
Back
has
and
to
forth.
do with actually how we write our objectives.
Yeah.
It absolutely could, and that's one way of thinking about your role, which would be somewhat different. Your role being one, playing a role of getting the various constituencies and stakeholder groups to come together around an aligned set of objectives, and that's actually a great strategy. And it addresses some of the concerns that we had earlier. Sort of a clearinghouse of what are other people thinking are important, aligning that with where you're wanting to take the state, and then getting them to actually maybe reshape some of what they're thinking and some of their strategies. So that the purpose of the board becomes more of that, let's get everybody on the same page.
Yeah, so you actually taking care of a couple of things here. One, get clarity on objectives, but you engage people in conversation. We see you have these objectives. You stay a little different. There's a conversation point. Then you say, boy, I think we're on the same page. I know, yeah, go ahead.
So in looking at your comments here, I think what confused me is that you were umbrellaing, you had a goal, and then you had a primary objective, and then you have specific objectives. So I guess I was unaware we were doing a primary objective. Is that
Well,
part of what we're doing? Or
No,
are we
I didn't.
just
I
listing objectives
apologize
underneath
for
the
not
goal?
being clear in that. What I tried to express there, and Harvey and I in conversation, it seemed that was the closest thing to an objective that had been emerging from these conversations. I think most of the other conversation related to lagging indicators, related to student achievement, or strategies essentially underneath there. So that just was, to me, the closest thing to a SMART objective that had emerged so far in the conversation. So I probably overarched when in terms of stating that, but it seems that that's how I characterize the discussions that we've seen so far, is that clearly in Goal 1 there is a desire to improve, as an objective, to improve all achievement. But the question is, which achievement do we need to focus on most importantly? What are the crucial pieces? And from that, there's been conversations about reading. We had a long conversation about reading scores, STEM, and some other pieces as well. And a lot of that falls back on how the assessments are done, where that data comes from in the first place is one of the things that needs to be sort of looked into. What data can we access, and how is that data accurate? So that was sort of part of what we were trying to drive at in terms of some of the foundational strategies that need to be put in place. But I apologize if the impression was that was the only objective. It just seemed to me the clearest one that was emerging. I don't see another one that this group has articulated that is as clear as a desire to improve student achievement in certain metrics.
Okay, one of the things we may want to do very quickly, you deal with this every day. We're picking up your vernacular. Objectives, and what are SMART objectives? What's a strategy? Leading and lagging indicators, because I think that would indicate there's some confusion on this.
Sure.
There's that slide that we have, Chris, if you can find it real quick, because it's a great point. What we're doing is starting with the big ideas and getting increasingly more specific. So the big idea of the goal 1, which is ensure that all students in Indiana learn, so that defines a broad area of what you want to accomplish. But let's get more specific about that. And are there some other objectives? Are there some objectives under that goal that more specifically speak to what you're after? So, but we're still defining what. We're not talking about how. So the objective that's stated under that goal 1, Indiana students will demonstrate an increase in achievement results with a decrease in the range between subgroups. So specifically, you're saying not only do we want them to learn, but we want them to demonstrate improved achievement results and close the gap. So that's another statement to further clarify what we mean by ensure all students in Indiana will learn. Now, you might have another objective around STEM to say that you want to show marked improvement specifically in STEM scores or what have you. That could be another objective. But you'll have 2 or 3 or 4 objectives within each goal. And then you break each objective down. Well, okay, if you're going to close the gap, for example, how are you going to close the gap? That's where you move from what you want to do to how. And that's when we begin to ask questions about, well, what does the research say? What works in terms of closing the gap? And so the strategies are yet another layer of detail on down. So we're getting progressively more detailed as we go through the conversation. So you can have several objectives for each goal. You might have 1 or 2 strategies for each objective. And then what we do is have leading and lagging indicators tied to those. Lagging indicators tied to objectives and leading indicators tied to strategies.
But we're getting, again, take the big thought and then begin to break it down into more and more specific thoughts is the progression.
Well, I understand that process. I just didn't understand that we were going to have a primary objective, and then I guess I thought these things that we talked about last time then would go underneath that.
Okay.
So I'm not,
Gotcha. Yeah.
that's not necessarily true.
Correct. No, you may have several objectives under each. Yeah, don't let the word primary there be the trip you up.
Oh, okay, because I
yeah.
thought we were going to narrow down from our conversation we had last time and choose some objectives that we wanted to work on
Right.
underneath, ensure
Right.
all students in Indiana learn.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but again, a lot of the conversations that you've had, Harvey and I, hear as strategies. And again, so just to run through the terminology, essentially the goals that you have identified, the idea there is that those are essentially focus areas. So what are the major areas that we want to focus our work on? And it seems that you've had a good conversation about the major areas we want to focus our work on: our students, the staff, and the stakeholders. 3 S's. Interestingly enough, you come up with 3 S's. So, those are the areas where you're going to focus. Now, within each one of those areas, you want to set measurable expectations, which our term for that is objectives.
So for instance, you take goal 1.
Mhm.
I'll throw out an objective just to start, because then we can get real practical with it. And we mentioned this, and I don't know how to say it, so I'll start this way. Indiana, you could say be leading, you could say top 10%, I don't care, would lead the nation in advancing reading in our students, reading competency. So literacy, however you want to call it. We would advance the nation. My assumption there, why this objective would be a worthy thing for us to lead on, is when children read well, their ability to learn science and be engaged in school, we all know the statistics are overwhelming. So you want to, as a board, we want to put that out as an objective where literacy becomes an objective this state drives hard at. And you could have nice leading and lagging indicators. We already have it in motion. It isn't like, it's not rocket science. We all know how important it is. We also know how damaging it is if you don't get that done well. So you can have a lot of strategies underneath it, whether it be with early childhood, vocabulary, engaging community. You can do a lot of neat things. A lot of strategies around what kind of data we want to put out there, what model programs we want to put out there. We could have policy decisions that if you pick something outside of what science-based research tells us in terms of reading, that's fine if you're achieving great results. If you're not, you might want to go check out some proven methods products. So my first objective under that would be around literacy, reading. The refined way to say it would be up for discussion, but that would be my offering. We mentioned it before. It's not new.
2 thoughts that I had while you were talking about that. One was one of the comments that came from several people in the stakeholders groups, just to reach back to that, was around this question of being a national leader. And there was sort of questions asked about why a national leader. Why is that important that Indiana be better than the other states? And is that, as a objective, something that will get us where we want to go in terms of having a good education system in Indiana? But the other point that I would make just from a practical standpoint is that if you craft that sort of objective, then the metrics become around comparisons between Indiana students and national students.
Could be
which requires, and international as well, but that requires some sort of level playing field in terms of measurement. And so one of the strategies that folds out of an objective like that is how do we measure, or do we measure student achievement in Indiana in such a way that it's comparable to student achievement throughout the country and throughout internationally? And is that, is that really, and then you'll need to craft strategies around making those measurements. So that seems to me one of the possible confusions in that sort of an objective, as opposed to an objective that sets expectations for student achievement in Indiana, which you can measure on a uniform way across Indiana, and the strategies that set up for that speak directly to the indicators. So, you know, a general objective that says students improve, you know, students perform better, and then a specific conversation about what are the areas in which you want that performance to be concentrated on. That leads to a set of strategies that says improve reading, you know, do things to help improve reading, do things to improve STEM in the state, and that sort of stuff, which, you know, may be closer to what you really want to do for the work. Just as a suggestion.
I don't know, what's the committee think about, how would we state that? Because your SMART goal objectives require some measurement, right?
Right, yeah, no, we want them to be measurable, absolutely.
So any thoughts?
I have a process question. The expertise of writing SMART objectives lies in you, our consultants. And are you envisioning the board formulating these objectives, or is the process to glean from us where we're going, sort of the STEM, the reading, and so forth, and then have consultants who are the experts come back with an array or a menu of possible objectives that when we that we would discuss? Because I'm sensing if we're going to write the objectives from the board level, that may not be the best use of our time. I'd rather deal with policy issues and then give you the opportunity to take those topics back and then come back to us with a set of well-written, SMART objectives.
Sure.
That's sort of what we've tried to do there, and again, I would also try and cut us out of the picture to a certain extent and say, again, you know, you have that expertise in the state, and that's part of the process that we would suggest that you put together going forward is to tap into the people in the department who have that sort of expertise, because they can give you that information as well as we can. We can give you the national perspective on it, but again, you know, next year and the year after and the year after, you're going to continue to have that need for that specific input, expert best practices input on these sort of things. So one of the things that we can help you do is establish that process.
Yeah, and to answer your question a slightly different way, but to say the same thing. Yes, we'll help you put together a first starter set, but we don't want to build a dependency on us in this process. So we're trying to set you up so that you're tapping into the other resources that you have, and by setting up these goal teams to continue that on an ongoing basis. So we'll suggest, once you give us the big rocks, the big thoughts, so, you know, and obviously the big thoughts.
You can help us refine.
We'll help you refine them. We'll suggest a measure. We can't give you the base where you are. That has to come from, you know, your own resources and your own data. But we can help you craft, you know, some of the language. And Chris has been doing it already, so we'll continue to do that. But to Chris's point, we don't want y'all dependent on us going forward. We like to do this work and then walk away from it and know that you're going to continue. So that's why we continue to play that card. Is we'll do it, but we really want to get you.
So if we could talk about a reading objective and how we want to measure it for a moment, we can tweak and refine that with you, but then we own that. Brett?
I guess this is a question for my colleagues. The one thing that I'm interested in knowing, and maybe we can get some technical assistance on this as well, is how do we manage philosophical discussions that will actually drive the strategy? And let me give you an example just on this very issue, because I share the vision that Dan has communicated. I want to see Indiana lead just on about every front, because I want the best for our kids. But one of the things I think about, and forgive me if I use a little basketball analogy here, but Coach Wooden, he was a pretty interesting individual. He had an interesting view on everything. And one of the things that he was asked one time by a reporter was why he never looked at the scoreboard. And he told the reporter that if I'm looking at the scoreboard and my head's not in the game, and if my head's in the game, the score takes care of itself. And one of the takeaways I've always had from that is that sometimes, and I've been guilty of this myself when we're working on strategic planning, is I start with the end score in mind and work my way backwards. And maybe that's the right way to go. I'm starting to rethink that, because I worry about, to the larger masses, what does that communicate? What is the fallout of that when it trickles down to the local level and all the way into the classroom level, versus strategies written from a philosophy of improving craft, strategies that are robust, that result in high performing achievement, that as a result we do lead nationally. And I don't know really how to work those into those philosophical conversations. I know we're going to have them because we're dealing with things like A to F and assessment, and I would assume that our strategies, our strategic plan and vision will encompass some of that. But philosophically, I don't know where we're all at as a board. Many of the board members are new, and I think you can have the same goal. It's kind of like the half glass full, glass half empty, but have the same goal. But I do think it's important to have some consensus around how we approach that work, because it will make a difference in the nature of the types of strategies that we put in. If my goal is national, and I want it to be, I want us to achieve that. One way I could come at that is just constantly work, and teach toward that assessment. And that probably does need to happen to some extent, but at the same time, too, do I give up working on craft? And those are the things I'm wrestling with, Rick and Craig, and I'd just be curious to get your... I don't know that you have a thought, or you can advise us to answer that. Maybe that's a discussion we have to have as a team and say, what is our focus? But I hope that makes sense using the wooden analogy, but that's one of the things I'm wrestling with.
So let me get back. So the first one, goal 1, is a student goal. To me, students need to know what it is that they're doing. When we write a goal that says, 90% of our kids in the state are going to do such and such, that means nothing to the kids. Like, it means nothing to them. But if we write a goal that says, at each grade level, students are going to read within the range of lexile that's appropriate for that grade level, then that's something parents understand, that's something the kid understands what they're supposed to do, and it's something that the teacher understands what they're supposed to do. But when we make goals, I guess I'm headed that same direction. It has to be viable to the people that we actually want to do it. If just setting goals, 90% of our kids will be graduation, that doesn't mean much to anybody except us who look at it. We have to put in very specific things that kids are going to do, that they know this is what they're going to do, this is what they have to do, and yes, the ultimate result is we have the kids graduate. Right. We have the results can be measured in that direction. We may want to use those metrics to measure it, but to actually say it and put it into words, you have to do it right there, that everybody understands what it is, that it's so clear that it makes that happen. And I'm gonna make a comment about being in the top 10 in the nation in reading. I told my assessment staff this: we do not have assessment right in the state of Indiana until we do move the NAEP needle. NAEP is a very tried and true reading comprehension piece at the national level that I feel is the most accurate measure of our students in reading. We can have a conversation about the last NAEP scores, but I look at NAEP in a whole different light than what maybe some people do. I look only at that bottom below basic, and everybody else above that is what I'm concerned about. Making sure that we move these needle in 3 large groups, not just the top 2. And so, it concerns me that, we keep talking about we want to have this percentage and this percentage and this percentage. We can always, numbers are numbers, stats are stats. And you said it already, Dan. You can make them look how you want to make them look sometimes. I want goals. I want goals that are right down to the individual student. I want kids to know when we see this what their job is, what their role is, and what it is they're going to do.
If I could, I appreciate the superintendent's comments. One of the things I don't want to be misunderstood on is I do want to see us excel. I want to see our students do well. I want to see our state recognized for top performance. What I'm worried about is that as we get into the strategies, I just want to be careful, similar to what was just said, that there are very specifics on how we do that. Because here's what I've noticed, and this is an observation, I may be wrong, but my observation is left unanswered. If we don't answer that question as a board, if we don't give some direction, and I don't think we have to write a prescription, I think we have to set some direction and give them the autonomy to figure that out. That what will happen is they'll fill in the blanks in trying to become the national leader with more assessments.
Yeah.
And I want to just, and the reason I'm saying that is this last night, one of my graduate students, who's a principal, I won't mention his name, he writes this, and he's being honest. He says between looking at the rest, how many days left? There are 55 days left in his calendar year. 55 days is all we have left. Between ISTEP, ECAs, Accuplacer, CoreLink, AP, no less than 21 of the 55 days will be dedicated to some form of a standardized exam for students. Now, I get that, but I just wonder, how do we balance that? And I'm not one of these people that says, well, you got to throw all the testing. I don't believe that. I think you have to have some balance. But I'm worried about if we don't provide reasonable direction as a board, the focus becomes on test prep, not on learning. And when the dominant culture is on testing, I think there are problems that are emerging, and I think it's why innovation starts to get a negative connotation to it, because innovation basically means you just want to keep raising the test scores. So I think this is the place to have this conversation, because we get this into strategies. I'm not opposed to goals that says we're going to be the national leader.
Well, we're writing objectives right now.
Right.
The goal is that ensure students
achieve, right.
Ensure all students in
Right.
Indiana learn.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that those strategies are going to be hard-hitting, meaningful. This is the things you've got to focus on if you want to push the needle.
So how about an objective around reading? How would you write it?
Well, let me, if I can speak to those. I mean, I think the policies conversations that you'll have are largely around strategies, probably, to a certain extent around objectives, but they really get down to the strategies, because that's where you're talking about how we're going to achieve these pieces. Remember that we're sort of an outline process. The goals, as you point out, is a very large, overarching piece. The reason I suggested that objective the way it was, my thinking...
What objective?
The first objective, the suggested objective that I put in the report that I provided you guys after the last session. The idea of saying that Indiana students will improve their performance with, a reduction between subgroups in certain metrics. Okay, now the conversation really seems to me is focusing around what are those metrics? What are the important things that we have to study? Reading, what's the reading metric? So what would happen is you would say, okay, what we really want to focus on here, kind of picking up on what you said about the coach, we want to focus on certain fundamentals. Those fundamentals might be STEM, they might be reading, might be graduation rate. All of those essentially could fit as lagging indicators under that umbrella objective that I suggested. So you would see a balanced scorecard that would come out that says, under this objective of improving student achievement, what we're going to look at are the following half a dozen to a dozen metrics that we believe as an organization are the most important metrics to look at. And we're going to find out what the baselines of those are, and we're going to set targets moving out into the future on all of those, and that you're saying that your expectations are for the LEAs and the State Department to operationalize, however, they operationalize this to increase those metrics in those areas. And that will put you on record as saying, to a certain extent, what you think are important, what you expect students to achieve, what you expect students to do. Underneath that will fall out a set of strategies to essentially address each one of those, because you're going to have reading strategies. How are we going to increase those reading scores? Those will be strategies that you'll be developing as time goes on. But each one of these layers fit together to tell the entire story that I think the superintendent is asking for, which is, the goal of the balanced scorecard essentially is to tell the whole story from top to bottom. But if you try and tell the whole story, just pack it all into the goals, for instance, or just into the objectives, then the structure of the scorecard and the process of the scorecard starts to break down.
But there's also there's an interdependence of objectives.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the interdependence is a critical piece here that you have to, you don't write one and then say, well, that's tucked away. So for instance, if we take reading objective, rough in an objective on it, then you start talking about standards, and you ensure our standards are written such that they prepare our children, young adults eventually, to leave school ready for success in the world. as citizens, as community leaders, certainly, and participate in the economy. Then that's interdependent on one that has effective assessment. So now you start saying, maybe you have 4 or 5 goals and they're independent, because if you have STEM, you have to have clear objectives, and you have to have a good assessment systems. If you have excellence in reading, if you have really high standards, being competitive nationally will take care of itself in essence. And if you have a proper assessment system. So then you start developing a STEM objective, a reading objective, a standards objective, assessment objective, and you start to flesh it out pretty well. Then that becomes, obviously, interdependent on how you prepare and develop your professionals that work with folks and how you engage your stakeholders. So there's none of these stand alone. And then the strategies, my experience is, when you develop strategies, they tend to transcend goal and objective areas because they start pulling there's a synthesis that takes on it. It's a form of a dialectic of philosophy.
But I would still suggest that from, at least from my point of view, that standards, assessment, these things are strategies at your level. They are things that you want to do. They're hows. They're a crucial how. You believe that you want achievement to increase by students. You set that as an expectation. If you don't have clear standards, if you don't have good assessments that measure those standards, and if you don't have a data system that makes that work, you can never let that objective up. So I really
the larger point, the interdependency still exists.
Absolutely.
So you have an objective on STEM, you have objective literacy, these strategies to get your standards in place and good assessment systems.
And those are pieces of work that you could scope out as a project, and there are projects underway right now. I mean, you're working on a project for standards. That's something that you could create a budget for. You could describe responsibilities and tasks and actually define that as a project right now. So in my mind, that's clearly a strategy in our terminology, because it's a how, it's a way that you're going to accomplish this. And so you put those pieces in place.
So would an objective then basically incorporate the concept that if the goal area is literacy, then the objective would be that greater than 90% of students are reading at grade level, or something along that lines, or maybe higher? I'm just throwing a percentage out, but I'm just saying, is that what you're trying to get us to on the objective? So we say, I'm going back up here to what do we need to accomplish? We need all students reading at grade level.
Exactly.
That's the objective.
And that's actually
all
not,
students reading at grade level.
Technically, it's not the objective, because really when you start to talk about this whole piece, the objective includes a lagging indicator. And as the process goes forward, that lagging indicator will have a baseline and then have a set of targets that you're going to set. So if you put all that piece together, saying basically what you've just said, that our objective is to improve student achievement, one of the things that we're going to focus on is reading, and we're going to use this metric to determine the reading. We're going to find out what the baseline, where we stand right now, and our targets for growth over the next 5 to 10 years are that number will go up and that subgroups will come closer together. And that whole picture together articulates, I think, what you're trying to say, which is that this is what our expectation is, this is how we're going to measure it, and this is the rate at which we expect it to climb. And that all together is essentially a SMART objective, because it has the measurable part, it has the results-oriented part.
Let's get from down this morning the big ideas. And several have surfaced. So literacy is a big idea.
Gotta have it.
And
STEM.
STEM is a big idea. Graduation is a big idea. What are those big things that you want to make sure we include in the plan, that we can structure it outside of this room, decide whether that big idea is an objective or it falls under another objective as a way to measure it. I mean, just to give you an example, the point Chris has been trying to make is, under this first objective where we talk about increased achievement results, we could fold under that the measure being where Indiana stands in terms of literacy on a national perspective. And then the target could be, you want to be in the top. You want to lead the nation. Or we can structure it and make it an objective, a separate objective. So, but we want the big idea. What are the things you want us to be sure to include in this thing? And we'll come back to with you. Here's a good way to structure it.
Okay, we have 3 suggestions on the table.
Yep.
Graduation rate, STEM achievement, and literacy and reading. Any others, or do you want to argue against those?
Not sure if I want to argue against them. I'm wondering about the whole concept of if you got STEM, I'm thinking career, I'm thinking around the lines of the college career readiness, what are the requisite knowledge and skills, how do we ensure that they've achieved that minimum requirement of knowledge and skills to be successful, whichever direction they head. I don't know, I'm just throwing that out there as a discussion piece. It seems to be a focus right now that we're staying on is how do we know that they're ready without requiring a bunch of remediation?
Well, I don't know exactly the answer to that. I have a lot of ideas around it. But there's where interdependence comes in with your standards writing and your how we do assessments and what standards are for career ready and what. I do know this, that in the we know the environment we live in a global economy. And so in a knowledge-based economy, this country being so far developed, will the jobs that pay commensurate with the standard of living established in this country that will be here will require high levels of education, higher levels than we ever thought possible for such a broad span of population. It used to be thought, well, if you could highly educate 5 or 6%, then they'll run the place and there'll be a bunch of jobs for everybody else. In our global economy, it doesn't seem to be turning out so well for us. So then, if you say, as a highly developed country, the most developed country in the world, our economy is 17 trillion. I think the next closest is probably 7 or 8. Then we better be educating people to take these highly skilled manufacturing, engineering, mathematics that are to have everything work well. And so we better achieve high at STEM, and then the standards written will be in it. That strategy, how we write standards and how we do assessments, and would fold in and be part of that synergy I was talking about. So they'd be reliant on it. So the objective would be, say, folks, we can't make it in the national or global economy if we aren't exceptional in STEM. Let's just face that. Our students can do it. We prove it every day in certain schools. Let's innovate. Let's find strategies. Let's get stakeholders involved and get it done. Now, that'll have to be laced in with our standard writing effort, whether it's career ready or, you know.
STEM is currently one pathway within our CTE pathways that we offer. So it's a pathway into itself. So maybe working with the broader scope of CTE could encompass one of the strategy pieces underneath that might focus on STEM. But CTE pathways is probably a broader concept to address.
Yeah, and I think that word achieve, we say we want all students to achieve, and this is where I'm struggling to get it down to literacy or what I'm trying to express, but one of the things, I had a great conversation with Vince Bertram at Project Lead the Way recently, and we were talking, and we said, one of the things that's clear, when you see a creative economy emerging around us, where basically it's not about how many things you can sell and earn a value in return, it's how you build a long-term relationship with the customer coming back for a good or service. What that means is getting to what Dan was just saying, we're going to see our students change all kinds of careers because it's going to change as the market changes. And the question becomes, I think achievement carries with it now a new meaning, which is what are the transferable knowledge and skills? Because you're not just going to fire everybody and replace them. You're going to take those same people and hopefully they've got transferable knowledge and skills to stay competitive. So I don't know how to express that, but I agree. STEM's in there, literacy's in there. I don't know if it's college and career readiness is the right term, but if we're trying to find an objective, I want to make sure we have something in there because that's a reality of a creative global economy, which is when you graduate, you better have transferable knowledge and skills, or we've spent 12 years getting you ready for what?
So what do you want to be the objective?
I think it's college and career readiness,
in some ways is what that lagging indicator is going to look like, because it's probably clear to us how you would measure literacy. That's there's been a specific suggestion around that. Graduation rate is an obvious one.
Yeah.
How do you measure? I mean, what is the metric that you would look at either for STEM or college and career readiness?
But those are two, I mean, I would contend those could be two objectives. Because you could put college and career ready, you could put everything under it. But
Right. The question is, how
I
do
wouldn't
they,
do that. I'd get more granular on
Yeah.
objective.
what's the metric you would look at to say how successful we are at this? Because ultimately, that's the question that you have to have. And, you know, certainly from the stakeholder groups, one of the things that emerged was that they would be willing to help do the research and help craft that, you know, that to a certain extent, it's the business community, it's higher ed, that are the ones that are receiving the product of the K-12 system, so that they could be involved in providing information about how, you know, or help craft what those indicators should be. Because ultimately, you have to come down with a decision about what you're going to measure, and that has enormous implications in terms of the objective. I mean, one of the things you see as you work with these balanced scorecard pieces is that, you know, as we say, what gets done. If you measure graduation rate only, if that's the only metric you choose, then the entire system will align itself to make sure that the graduation rate goes up, and it'll do whatever it needs to do to make that graduation rate go up. That can have unintended
Without waivers.
Right, and it can have unintended consequences. So,
I do think it's possible, though, that we may, and we can park this, I don't want to lose sight of it, we can park it, because I think we can answer it at some point, because we're working on standards right now. Hopefully, they're going to produce graduates
Correct.
that do what I just described, which
That's
are
what I
they
was
have the
thinking.
requisite knowledge and skills that are transferable, which means we're then going to create and adopt a state assessment that's going to determine if, in fact, they have those before we launch them into life.
and that may
So
be the
we may not
lagging
know what it
indicator.
is today, but I'm just
Right.
saying we can park it, but I don't want to lose sight of it, because when we start getting to the strategies, that's where I want to have an honest conversation about what does it take to get them ready to demonstrate mastery of that.
That's what I was going to suggest, is that how you write your standards should be, reflect how you want to measure those, you know, the child's ability to pick up transferable skills and lifelong learning and those kinds of things. I think standards more and more these days are being written to measure those higher level learning.
If we had an objective on graduation rates, and we had an objective about STEM achievement, and we had an objective about literacy achievement, what would be another objective? Because one of the things that has happened, out of frustration largely, people would perceive and read data that would indicate our schools are not preparing our children for the world they're going to move into. So you tend to gravitate for something nobody can argue with. How about, let's teach them to read. Can they do science and math? Can they do mathematics, usually? Reading, writing, arithmetic, and then the larger purposes of education, what Vince is talking about, which is really quite interesting. You see it in higher ed, you see it all over the economy. You see outstanding innovators and executives that run large organizations that it isn't those particular pigeonholed achievement scores that help them be of great service to the world and organizations, but when you tie it all together. So how do you write an objective around someone's ability to be sensitive to people and build relationships? And I would think of citizenship, human relationships, cultural literacy, et cetera. But what's the objective we want to monitor there, and how do we make it a smart objective that we can measure?
No, but I love the
Is that the
question.
question?
No, I love that question, because I've thought about that too. I mean, the character education component becomes critically important, because it is going to be a set of relationship skills that are going to help them be prosperous long term. That's part of what drives that economy. And I don't know. And one of the things I guess I'm struggling with too, and this is again, we're learning a process while we're trying to do a process. I feel like it's sometimes that I'm struggling a little bit, but it's making sure too that I suspect the people who can help us most with the strategies are probably people directly in the field right now that may have some thoughts to offer. It seems like the strategy might help inform the lagging indicator. I know it sounds strange, but it seems like in my mind, if you can articulate how you're going to get that done, somewhere in that conversation, you're going to start to identify a metric. But I may be wrong on that.
No, you're absolutely correct.
Yeah.
They do inform.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, you could think about, at this group that's saying the policy, these are the things we want to measure. We don't necessarily know how to measure them yet. Some of the things we know. measure literacy and measure graduation rate. It's less clear how to measure, STEM outcomes. It's less clear how to measure college and career readiness or character outcomes or any of these other things. But you can set those expectations and then engage the specialists in saying, what already exists, what's already in place that we can use, engage your stakeholder groups in asking, what are the metrics that you would look at? Because ultimately you do have to, prove whether your strategies are working.
But see, that's
Science, math achievement's fairly easy. You
That's
set
where I wanna push
standards,
back.
you have a good assessment, and you know if they know science, and maybe some of them are for the career and technical. But I'm the character, your ability to relate, develop relationships. We don't test someone's ability to be a good salesperson, but I know an awful lot of them that make a really great living, and they kind of make the world go around.
Well, we have talked about character before, and I know it's in the document, and I don't think we have a set of standards or a set of criteria at this point, so maybe that's something that we need to keep on the front burner, that has to be done. But I'm happy that it's already in the plan, and we need to put some meat around that. My other question deals with Indiana standards. Where are those fitting in? Are they supposed to fit into this section of the document, or is there another part of the document that Indiana standards fit in?
That'd be part of the strategy, wouldn't it? To make
Right,
sure
so we haven't really talked about Indiana standards, I don't believe, today inside this particular, so should that be added also? We were sort of listing literacy, STEM, and so forth. Should that be added here?
I think it belongs in this goal, clearly. You could include it as a strategy, because it goes back to how you measure some of the lifelong learning. You want to write strategies so that, you want to write standards so that they're measuring the right things. You want to make sure that you're writing standards that you know that a child is going to be not only are they college and career ready, but they're actually going to be successful in their career. So I think standards underlie all of what we've talked about, and even leads into the next goal, which is around teacher prep and those kinds of things. So strategies, that is something that undergirds a lot of what we're talking about.
So could character standards be built into the Indiana standards that we are looking at currently? Do whatever we want, right?
With regard to standards.
That seems to
those
make
are-
the most sense to me is
The Indiana standards tend to be around academic.
right. So
And pieces and parts, not the
important point is that it needs to be included somewhere. If it's not part of the Indiana standards, it needs to be included somewhere.
But it could be a strategy that we create a set of dispositions for lifelong learning, and we start to work towards that, and out of that comes some kind of a metric. I guess I wanted to push back on something related to this point that Dr. Freitas is making, and something that you said, Craig. This is my concern, is when we do this, is we'll say, well, here's an area, and then the next question we move to is, what do we have available to measure that? And that scares me, because here's what happens. The second we move to that question, that conversation actually would drive the strategies. And I may be wrong on the process, but it just seems like to keep the focus on the strategy to hit the end objective, I want to have the conversation about the strategy. And out of that, then articulate what's a leading and lagging indicator for that strategy so that we know we're doing it, and let that drive it back to the objective and then back to the goal. Does that
Absolutely.
That's my
Yeah.
John Wooden analogy that I was trying to communicate earlier that bothers me, because I feel like that's how we do reform, is we're going, okay, well, what do we got? Well, we got I-STEP scores. What else we got? Well, we got attendance data. What else we got? And I'm worried about moving the ball forward, and to do that, if this was any kind of enterprise, I'd want to put the emphasis on the strategy and know that it's the right strategy, and then what are the leading lag indicators that guide that strategy so I can make course corrections to the strategy to hit my objective.
Brad, I agree with you. To do it the other way would certainly constrain
Right, exactly.
what we're trying to do, and there may
Limits
be some,
innovation.
to use the term of today, innovative ways
Right.
or innovative strategies or innovative goals that if we look at an assessment first, then that would certainly constrain what we want to do. So I totally agree. We should have an open mind and put it out on the table, discuss it, either accept it or reject it, not on the basis of whether there's an assessment available.
Yeah.
No, and I didn't mean to
No.
imply that. The first question is, how can we measure what we're interested in. We'll take character as an example, or college and career readiness is probably an easier example. How can we assess objectively whether we're having progress in that area? The first question you would ask is what metrics are out there already, and are they appropriate metrics? In this case, there's not necessarily an assessment that's going to take place in the K through 12 level, which is going to give you the answer to whether the kids are college and career ready, because really what you want to know is how they are succeeding in college. So we're talking about things like remediation in college that's necessary, and success in entry into careers is really what you want to be measuring. So those are metrics that you can't necessarily build into your state assessment. So at that point, you need to go out to the stakeholder groups and engage them in a conversation about how we can actually measure as a state whether the kids that are coming out of 12th grade, whether the ones that are graduating without waivers, are being successful in college or in careers. So a lot of these objectives, the lagging indicators and the objectives may well lead you to a strategy, which is we've got to do some research, we've got to figure this out, and we've got to establish what this metric is going to be. I completely agree with what you're saying. That metric is a very important indicator because it will give people a message that this is what we expect people to do. And if you say, that all of these things are stuff that's already assessed by the assessment system or in the standards, then you're very, very much limiting what's going on, and you're undercutting your ability to have a college and career ready objective, or an objective around college and career ready. So I didn't mean to make the impression that we drive it off of what data already exists, but that's the first question that I ask in these cases is, do we have data already that we can look at? Because it would be, if we have good data, if we have a good reading measure that's useful and accurate and makes sense, then we adopt that. Also because that gives us history, it gives us a longitudinal history on that particular metric. You don't want to have to create all your metrics from whole cloth, but there are some that you're absolutely going to have to, especially given if you have a more audacious plan, a plan that has a wider range, which is really what the conversation seems to me have been in this committee and the board, is a wider look. And that's going to require some strategies to create those metrics, or to at least settle on what are the important metrics that are out there. So you may well have a number of, as Rick said, you may have a number of focus areas, and some of those metrics, the lagging indicators, may well be TBD for now. And that's fine as long as there's a strategy to address that. If you just put a TBD there and let it go, that's not really responsible. But if you have a plan for how we're going to figure that out, and what the dates are that we're going to come by that metric, and how we're going to put that together, that's a strategy that, similar to the strategies you have around, you're creating a set of standards right now. It's a process that's underway. And we all know why that's being done. So we can base the expectations on those standards, and we can create assessments that measure those standards. You don't have that right now, but you're working ahead on these strategies to put that in place, with the understanding that you have a goal and objective to get that done. So you're really in the process of a lot of this stuff of the balanced scorecard process.
So if I was going to summarize, we've talked about literacy, STEM, graduation rates, college and career ready we can measure. And then there's this large objective. I don't know if it's about the student's ability to pursue truth, beauty, justice, and understand the dignity of each human person, or if it's character and citizenship or whatever. But we shouldn't be constrained. We should be courageous and say, well, if it's not easy to measure, what I was trying to express earlier, I think people's frustration, they took pieces of education. These are easier to measure. Let's measure them. And the larger person that compels most people to go into education, what do we do about when I educate someone, how do they think of themselves and their duty to their fellow human beings, and et cetera, et cetera. Most educators had a larger kind of calling to get into it, and the pieces and parts we're measuring so much now, maybe we're losing the larger piece because it's hard to measure. But we want some, it seems to me we want some objective around character, citizenship, your traits, your dispositions, maybe that turns out in voting percentages, and I don't know what to think about.
Sure.
Is that a good summary, though, of the objectives?
Absolutely. And to go back to Superintendent Ritz's point about, how does this speak to students? Well, if one of the ways that you decide to measure citizenship, for instance, is by measuring involvement in community, community outreach, community involvement, volunteerism, some sort of participation, then what that says is, what we value is that sort of participation. It will drive that behavior. If you see what I'm getting at. If what you're going to measure is as a part of your character citizenship indicator is, the number of students that are involved in volunteer work, or however you want to measure that, that will increase the amount of volunteer work, or it will lead to strategies that push towards an increased amount of volunteerism. So in that, you will be, collecting. If you say literacy, well, then what that says to the students is you need to learn to read. That's your job in putting this thing together. So that's where those lagging indicators start to inform the behavior and the expectations that you have set for behavior.
Or you could even begin to measure character and citizenship. Now, this doesn't really get entirely what you're talking about, Dan, but, part of that, a child's attendance, a child's behavior patterns.
Sure.
Those kinds of things are reflective of character. So you
Yeah.
may have some good indicators. Maybe the message there is that
There's a way in which the whole educational process is an indication of character. It's deferred gratification, it's persistence. Frankly, interestingly, at higher ed, when they take this data apart, some would say they're character traits that will pull you through.
Grit
Are you
is the new
persistent?
research term, right? For persistence, it's all about grit, and that's one of the key criterion that they're using now.
Which would come out in college career ready, because if they have the grit, there's a way in which the educational enterprise and your success and plugging away, if we have the right avenues, shows some of the things we very much want, like your commitment to learning, deferred gratification, grit, persistence, staying focused, discipline to a larger goal, even though it's not. So it'll be interesting to unpack. I just wanted to kind of summarize on this goal because we have some other goals.
I do have a question though before you go on. So character and citizenship education is one of those big thoughts. Graduation, we talked about CTE and college and career ready. Is CTE, does that fold all under graduation and college? Is college and career ready tied to graduation, tied to CTE?
Yeah,
you want
a
to
lot
put
of
that
it is.
bundle that together?
So let me just throw an objective out there. Maybe someone can write it down and we can just kind of keep it for a little while. All students will engage in college and career pathways to develop character and knowledge to be successful in post-secondary work. Now within that, there's like a zillion strategies. Everywhere from making sure all kids are actually having access to pathways, getting your counseling programs in line, making sure that we're aware of what's out there for kids, making sure that we're offering character development classes or career courses that are actually working in that aspect, to doing some of the measures that you guys already talked about. If we say that here's what all students will do, then I think we can go about putting in, and that's where the strategies come in. We have to talk about all those to see what kind of metrics rise to the forefront to see that we want to use. So if we also said students will read within a grade level Lexile band appropriate to their grade level, that's saying we want all kids reading on the grade level. I don't care what grade level they're in. We want that to happen all the time. And what kind of measures are we going to be looking at to make sure that we know that? Make sure that kids know that they're reading at their grade level and always making sure that they're doing that. I have a sense that we're talking about all the same thing. And we want students to have these opportunities, and access is going to enter into this, and achievement's going to enter into this, and all of those aspects and metrics are going to be part of that. I just have this strong desire that it's going to be not metric driven, but student driven. That students will, and you started out that way when you said Indiana students will demonstrate, okay, an increase in achievement results. And I guess why I was pushing back so much on that is because that lets everybody know right off the start, I-STEP's the measure. I-STEP's the measure for what we're going to look at no matter what. And it may be a measure that we look at for certain things, but I don't want it to be, taken as this isn't another I-STEP measure.
Sure.
And here's how we're going to get at it. So I just want it to be student-driven. Students will. And I loved your analogy about goal number 2. Staff will. And then the next one, stakeholders. Let's really talk about what each of those entities is going to play a part in what this strategic plan is going to be all about. And I'm totally in line with you guys. I think we should put them out there in general terms, have lots of dialogue, talk about strategies, get our experts in here. And as we move towards, because we are at a good place here where we're talking about standards and assessments and accountability, and having that all pooled together within a framework of some general guidelines for objectives, I think would just be awesome, actually.
So the Lexile discussion will need some discussion. Achievement,
sure.
Lexile, some people, there's disagreement on that. But what I hear you saying, students will achieve literacy. Now, how we want to measure, it will be some more discussion. They'll achieve in STEM subjects. They will achieve by graduating without waivers. They will achieve, this is real important to students that they graduate. It's real important that they can read. It's real important they can write. It's real important they know mathematics. It's real important they graduate. It's real important they have character and citizenship traits that help them advance. And it's real important they're college and career ready, and that'll show up in some data. So data and clear objectives are not antithetical to doing what's good for students. That's how you keep some focus. So, I mean, you said something to the effect, I think we're all on the same page, but I don't want to get the idea. We don't want an objective that's about a bunch of inputs. Eventually, there's strategy to drive the outcome, but this has to be outcome and performance-based, or to me, you don't want to check the box. Oh yeah, we have a counselor for everybody. We have a strategy for everybody, so it's good.
Right.
We've got to show the outcome. If 70% of your students that go to college, four-year college, drop out after the first semester, it's not good. That's not good. You could say, no, we have a whole system here. But no, the outcome's not good.
Yeah, your point about outcome.
Outcomes.
Yeah, outcome measurement
That's
is
your
really
objective.
important. If you look at all the accrediting bodies, particularly in higher education, teacher education, and almost all the other fields now, they're going outcome-based rather than input. And it used to be a decade ago, 2 decades ago, all input. And so it's totally the opposite. So I totally agree with Dan that it needs to be outcome measures. The other important point is that there has to be multiple indicators on the dashboard. Sometimes we fall into the trap of one assessment. And I hear this often in based on what's good practices, again, to go back to that, there should be multiple indicators that are leading and lagging indicators. And if we don't have enough, maybe we need to look at other states or what other people are doing. But the notion that we have one indicator for a particular priority for us, I think is a mistake. So I would hope we'd have multiple
I'm
indicators.
certainly suggesting
So
multiple
is there,
indicators.
it sounds like there is, but is there consensus that strategy helps inform metrics, and the purpose of the metrics then is to really understand the extent to which we're doing the strategy well? I mean, the analogy that I'm thinking of is, I spent a lot of time at the hospitals lately because I got a wife that's going through some challenges, but thankfully the way they approach it is they have a strategy, but that strategy dictates certain tests and measures, and they're using the information from those tests and measures to alter the strategy or to go more aggressive or less aggressive. And to use as an analogy of the classroom, that's where I really want to see is when we talk about being data-driven, that's what I'm holding out hope for, is that we start with a clarity around to achieve in those areas we just discussed, There are certain known strategies that are research-based, best practice. Everybody knows those are the things you've got to be doing. Those are the non-negotiables. And from that, what are the leading, lagging indicators? Because you got to have some metrics. Otherwise, you're not going to know. It's going to be hallucination if you try to speculate how you're doing.
So Brad, what you're saying, there needs to be a diagnostic component. The notion that all our indicators are just summative is not useless, but it's not as good as
Yeah.
having a diagnostic
Yeah.
Oh,
component.
your lagging indicators are certainly summative. Your leading indicators, which are tied to the strategies, and to go back to what Superintendent Ritz said about the pathways, because I think it's important to talk about that for a minute. If the idea of participation in pathways was proposed as a lagging indicator, in other words, an objective measure, the question that I would ask is, do we have reason to believe that simply including students in pathways will result in increased performance?
Wouldn't that be a leading indicator?
Well, that's what I'm trying to get at. Is
Yeah,
that
that's not a lagging.
If we're expecting, if our argument is that, and I accept your argument that participation in pathways is an important part of the student experience, then there's two ways that you could handle it. You could handle it as a lagging indicator and say the number of students engaged in pathways is a goal that we have, an objective, smart objective, and we're going to create some strategies to increase the number of students involved in pathways. And if simply participation in pathways was a good, solid predictor of success in outcomes, then that would be one way to handle it. Another way to handle it would be to think of participation in pathways as a strategy that leads to college and career readiness, for instance. And then what you would do is you would say, okay, the number of students participating in pathways would then become what we call a leading indicator, because it would be tied to a strategy which says getting more students involved in pathways is something that supports the overall success and achievement of the students. And you would have then an indicator that was tied to that question of strategies. It would not be a lagging indicator tied to an objective, but it would rather be a leading indicator tied to strategy. So that's what we mean by both leading and lagging indicators. You
Can I
have
ask
to
a
measure
question?
strategies. Yeah.
I want to ask a process question on that, because this gets to tomorrow a little bit. Am I wrong in thinking that it seems like the approach should be basically we identify a box for them. Basically, we're saying this is what we want to achieve. This is what we want to achieve in, and we've described that today already to some extent. Literacy, STEM, some of these other areas. Do we have to set indicators first before we get to strategies? Can we go to the stakeholder groups and say, what would you see as paramount, as the most paramount strategies to get kids to achieve in these areas, and just let them give that back to us along with their recommendations on how we might measure some of what they're recommending, so that we can sift through that and make some decisions before we settle in on a leading lagging indicator. Am I wrong on that? Or
Say that again, Brad. I'm sorry.
I just wondered, in the process of this work that we're doing, if it would be wise for us, and maybe this is what we're doing, is saying for each of these goal areas, so we're using achievement, we say to the group coming tomorrow, we met today, and this is what we want to achieve in. We want to achieve in graduation, we want to achieve in STEM, we want to achieve in literacy. And they're the stakeholder groups. They're coming in, and they've got knowledge and experience on how to do this well, or maybe access to research on how to do well. Let them help define for us the strategies that will get that done, including recommendations on some metrics
Sure.
of leading and lagging, so that we can analyze that.
So if we put out objectives there around literacy, STEM, graduation, career college ready, character, citizenship, there's a whole deal there. And so we're going to measure these. And your leading and lagging indicators are a little different in that one's more of a measurement outcome, the other is measurement of, I guess, are you implementing high impact practices that'll get you there? There's some predictability here. And then we engage in that process, right?
Yep. And I would rather than telling them we want the recommendations on leading and lagging, I'd like to take the questions and say, for each strategy, tell us how you'll know when you've reached it, which would be your lagging, and tell us when you'll know that your strategy is working. What would you look at? I'd be curious to hear what they'd say, because to me what that starts to do is it builds ownership into those leading and lagging indicators, because now I know why those leading and lagging indicators were picked, and they weren't just because somebody arbitrarily said, well, we've got accessibility to this metric, let's use that.
In your coaching example you used earlier, not looking at the scoreboard, I know what was going on in that coach's mind. There are things that he's watching that are leading indicators.
That's right.
And he could probably articulate those, or maybe not, but they're just things that you're watching to make sure that the game is going well and the right things are being done. And those are really good, those are those indicators of success. And he's right, if all of your leading indicators are saying the right things, and the end result, the score, at the end of the game is going to win. So, but understanding those, you have to, coach has to understand his own strategy.
That's right.
So your point is, you got to know your strategies before you really know what to watch, and that determines your.
Right. I think that's what Woodin was saying. He's focused on seeing them execute the strategy on the floor, and if he's managing the leading and lagging pieces on the floor, that takes care of itself.
I mean, in our terms, essentially, the scoreboard would be the lagging indicator. The leading indicators are the things that Rick is talking about, and the fact of the matter is that when you're doing this work, you don't watch those lagging indicators.
Right.
You set those as expectation levels, then you define how you're going to get there, and the metrics that you watch from day to day are the metrics that are related to whether you're implementing those strategies and whether those strategies are working. And that would be what you would look at, and any organization that would move this process forward in implementation would actually be quarterly looking at those leading indicators to make sure that you're actually getting that work done. And that's what Rick is driving at. The coach doesn't need to look at the scoreboard, because looking at the scoreboard doesn't necessarily help win the game.
I want to tweak that just a little bit because it's real close, and I agree with you. But here's the fine tuning I would do on it. I think the lagging indicator in that illustration is the ball went in the basket, because that's how he knew the strategy worked. And the outgrowth of hitting the lagging indicator is the big picture view, which is we met the overall goal, which is we're winning games by excess number of points, and that's where we get back to being a national leader, which is what I want to see.
I like the points, but I'll go with you.
I hear you.
I visited with John Wooden before, had a long conversation with him.
But that was awesome.
Well, it was awesome, but I think he paid quite a bit of attention to the scoreboard. I understand that he knew every win. He could describe every win. He described how far they were at halftime ahead of this game, and then he said going to the third quarter, it was before they had halves. So I
thought you were going to do the whole I knew John Wooden and you're no John Wooden.
It did occur to me.
And I knew John Naismith.
Are we on the same page here around goal line? Pretty much. We use some different language.
I think this has been helpful because we're talking conceptual issues. I sense that we're moving toward a consensus, at least among us, and feel that we're getting some traction. I'm really pleased with the stakeholder engagement that you talked to us about, and I like Brad's idea to get them engaged along the way and to have them give us suggestions. And it reinforces that notion of two-way communication, because last time we did the stakeholders, we were providing them a document and saying, respond to this. And so changing that around to say, we're interested in your ideas. Put those forward, and then the board will take a look at that. I really like that two-way communication, and it empowers them too.
And Brad had two specific requests there. What would you measure down the road to say you're there, and what would you want to measure and keep track of that would increase the likelihood we'll get to the basket and the hole in the victory, correct?
I just pulled the questions there. How do you know you've reached your objective, which is the definition of lagging, and how do you know it's working?
Yeah. So I think it sounds to me like there's good consensus that the main buckets that you want to include in your achievement objectives are literacy, STEM, college, CTE, STEM, however you want to say that.
Were you combining that, or are those separate?
Well,
I would say they're separate, but what?
CTE and STEM, I guess it depends on.
College and career ready?
No, I
or
was
you're
actually
talking about.
Yeah, career.
Oh, I
technical
see.
education.
Okay, all right.
But
Keep going. STEM.
And then graduation, college and career readiness, and something about character and citizenship. Sort of 5 big buckets that seem to be.
Does that sound right?
Are you separating graduation from college and career readiness, or are they the same?
I thought we were, but graduation's one milestone you can pick up on. If you're graduating a lot of students, that's a good thing. It should lead to a lot of good things, and it'll avoid a lot of really bad things, because if you don't graduate high school, we know all the stats. Now, there's a next level. What percent of your students are persisting, getting jobs, et cetera? In other
So
words,
you want to separate.
They should be separate, I think.
I think
Sure.
so.
Yeah, I think you've got few enough that there's no need to pack them together. And
Are we on the same page?
I think so.
Superintendent Ritz, how do you feel about this?
Yeah, I'm not sure how the intern citizenship's gonna pan out
Yeah, it's
in
a,
terms of strategies and measures.
it's a journey. I mean, there's a lot of work.
That's
to be
going to
done.
take a little courage. We're going to probably end up being in some lively
It's going to
discussion.
take a little character.
It's going to. We're going to have to see if we have persistence. Grit.
True grit.
Do you folks need a break?
Yes.
Okay. I would propose a break. Do I hear a second?
Mr. Chairman, can we break?
This meeting is not adjourned, but it's under,
Oh, thank you.
yeah, we're taking recess. Stretch. That was my favorite part of the school day, that and lunch.